Now here's a more detailed slide on the cut depth controls. If you look at the dialog over here, we're talking about everything from cut depth control down in the dialog right here that you see. You can use this dialog to precisely control your roughing cut depths and also your finishing cut depths. And it's got a number of, parameter fields and sliders. We're going to go over this basically in detail. But if you look at these 4 pictures on the left, if you look at the orange line, that is where the geometry that you selected for your control geometry in this dialog. So if the geometry that you selected is at the top of your cut, you would pick that top. If it's at the bottom, for instance, if you just have a 2D drawing and it's located at the, on the XY plane at Z0, so it's at the bottom of your cut, so you would pick that bottom. If you, for any reason, you don't want the top of the cut to be at the top or the bottom of the geometry that you have selected, you can use the pick top to tell it where to start, and then use your cut depths to tell it how deep to cut. So this is very helpful in certain situations. For example, if you just look at this picture here, there's no part geometry, but we have a stock model defined. So in this particular picture, the user wants to cut below the bed of the machine slightly, okay, to make sure they go all the way through. They're going to cut a little bit into their spoil board, buffer board. So you can use the pick top, tell it where to start, the cut depth, how depth to go, and that can pass the bottom of your control geometry if you need it to be. And then this other picture just goes over the dialog, how you can break up the rough and the finish depths. Again, this is one of the more complex concepts for new users to grasp, but once you understand how it's broken up and how the parameters work, it's pretty straightforward. So to follow on the cut depth controls, we're going to look at this particular part here and how you can use the cut depth controls for different depths. So in this particular part, this is a little bit more complex, but the program takes care of it for you. We have 2 pocket areas, but they're not at the same depth. So our control geometry, we just pick the bottom of each pocket and defined the cut depth controls, and it figures that out for you based on the different depths of the pocket. So that's one thing that you may not know that the program can do, so you can take advantage of that, and we'll be looking at that in detail. So here you see we got 2 pockets. We've got an open pocket here. I mean, they're both blind pockets, but we have a certain depth here and a different depth here. If you go to a front view and we go to you'll see that we have a pocket that's at this depth and another pocket in the background here behind this counterboard that's at this depth. So if you want the same cut parameters to apply to each pocket, you can do them in one operation. It'll figure out the different depths for you, the different cut depths. But I also wanted to show you the cut depths here. So if you look at this dialog, and you can't see it when the dialog is displayed, but I'll just go over them and then show you. So if you look at this dialog, the cut depth controls, the first thing you're going to want to set is what's the total depth of the pocket? What's the total depth of the profile operation? How deep do you want to cut? Okay. Now, again, we mentioned the location of cut geometry. So in here, you're telling it where the geometry is that you selected. In this particular example, we selected the bottom of the pockets, okay? So this cut depth is being calculated based on the bottom of the cut, the bottom of this pocket. So it's going to start cutting 0.365 inches above that bottom, and it's going to work its way down, okay? So again, you know where the bottom is. Okay, you're entering a cut depth. If you don't know what the cut depth, you can use this little icon and pick 2 points and it'll figure out what the depth is. So in this example, we have two depths. You want to pick your lowest depth, your deepest depth to be your cut depth. And it'll calculate your, if you have one that's not that deep, it'll figure that out for you and not cut. Obviously, it's not going to cut all the way down if your control geometry is up here. But we have the total cut depth, okay? That's the first thing you need to determine. And in this little picture in the dialog, you see total cut depth, okay? So that's how deep the cut is going to be when the cut is done. So then consider you can divide that total depth into two segments, a rough segment and a finished segment. So you may want to, you may not want to have your last cut depth, your last cut level, you may not want to cut, a quarter of an inch, at that depth, because obviously you may have some tool deflection, or you may, whatever, it may affect the accuracy of your sidewalls, or where the exact Z depth is. The more you cut, obviously, the more kinematics come into play on the machine. So you're probably going to want to cut the finish area up into smaller cut levels. So determine in your mind the roughing section and the finishing section, your depths. So we got a 365 total depth. We got a 300 thousandths for the rough, and we got 65 thousandths for the finished depth, okay? Then you can divide both of those into how many levels. So for the roughing area, we want a 0.1 level. So there's going to be 3 levels in roughing. And then there's going to be 0.02 per level in the finishing. So that'll be 4, maybe 4 or 5 levels. We'll look at it in a minute. But you can use these sliders, or you can just enter the exact cut level. So this is the amount of material that the tool is going to cut at each one of these levels. Okay, so you have exact control. And again, this has nothing to do with necessarily where your stock is or where your part is. You're telling it exactly based on where your location of your cut geometry is and these depth values. So you have absolute control. Go ahead.
Yeah, Don, I have a couple of items I wanted to point out. So Don was able to machine these two pockets that have differing depths by selecting the curves at the bottom of the pocket and then setting the location of cut geometry at bottom. So that way, the cut is never going to go below the cut geometry. So that's a very smart way of doing multiple depth pockets if you're selecting the bottom of the pocket, and then but you got to make sure that a at bottom is set. Otherwise, the cut's going to start from the curve and go down. So, and the next thing I want to point out is, Don, if you move the cursor a little bit, yeah, you see the final cut depth that he's got is 0.02 for the finished cut depth, while the total finished cut depth is 0.065. And as you can see, the 0.065 does not uniformly divide into 0.02. So if you take 0.065 divided by 0.02, you get what, 0.325, something like that, right? So your cut depth is not going to be exactly 0.02 because your total finish depth is 0.065, and we cannot, put 2 cut depths, which means the third one is going to be, left hanging. You're going to leave some material. So what we do is we take the finish depth and divide it equally. So your final finish depth of 0.02 is honored, which means it's going to be smaller. The actual finish depth is going to be slightly smaller. So I hope that makes sense, because we evenly divide your total depth to give the even number of cuts, or rather the integral number of cuts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So this cut depth might not always be what you see
Let's
being
look
generated.
at the actual depths here. So those are the actual depths that were calculated.
Yeah, if you look at your...
And again, you can see these depths if you go into, pick this little dialog right here. It'll show you what the exact depths are. You'll see that you had one that was slightly not as deep. This last one's not as deep, like you mentioned, Joe.
Yeah.
and then you go on
And then,
down.
yeah, and if you look at it, go to the bottom one, 15 and 16. Yeah, those are your finish cuts, and you saw we set it as to be 0.02, but if you see the difference between 15 and 16, it's not 0.02, it's less than 0.02, slightly less than 0.02. So we divided evenly to give us something less than what you've specified in the dialog. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, that's something that needs to be understood. Okay, let's see what else we got here. We got about almost wrapped up here. We did that slide. Any questions, Joe? I did want to mention, is it okay we go over just a few minutes? I did want to
Yeah,
talk
go
about
ahead.
the
Yeah, that's
posting.
fine. Yeah, go ahead.
So in the, let me go back to the posting issues slide here so I can see. Okay.